Okay, great. Well, hello everybody. I'm glad you could join us. This is the CBRC Builders Architect Roundtable. We're going to be learning about conquering the codes, and we've got a couple great guests here. Um, I'll have Cherie introduce our guests here in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I just want to thank our sponsors that allow us to get out there and do all of our Zoom calls and continue to add benefit to our custom builders. We have Lifescapes Colorado out there, always a huge, great company to work with. Belgard, we have Pella Windows that helps us out quite a bit. Kitchler, Colton Mortgage, and of course Ferguson and Builders Appliance Center. From there, I'm gonna go ahead and hand off to Cherie so she can introduce our guest for today.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to HBA Custom Builder and Remodeler Council for providing such a great networking and best practices to the CBRC council members. And thank you to all those sponsors that you listed off, Jason. We couldn't do it without them. It's a pleasure to be asked to announce today's panelists. Andre Hyen of Jefferson County is with us with the Department of Building Safety, and also Steve Thomas of Colorado Code Consulting. And we're really looking forward to your presentations, and we thank them for being with us this afternoon. So I'd like to hand that over to Andre, who's going to kick it off.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cherie. So let me go ahead and, there we go. Okay, is that coming through for everyone? Okay, great. I was asked today to talk about Jefferson County's adoption of what we're calling Appendix Z. Appendix Z is our attempt to try and facilitate some construction mitigation, specifically when it comes to wildland-urban interface. So what we did is we took Section 5 of your WUI code from the 2018, gutted it and replaced it with some language that we thought better fit kind of the direction that we wanted to go as the county, but that was the direction that we started with. To kind of give a little context for where we are and where we're going, Jefferson County Planning and Zoning has been doing defensible space mitigation, site improvements like that, liaisoning with fire departments when it comes to new builds and rezonings and new subdivisions for a long time. So that's kind of historical. As we move forward, this is that first step to bridge what they call the home ignition zone, right? And to get on that structural ignitability side. So moving forward, we adopted the code January 1st of 2020. It's currently posted and available on our website, so you can see the text for yourself. You'll see two versions, and the reason we had to do this way is because it's an appendix. It's not a proper adoption, so we added it to our existing code book. So you'll see one for essentially building codes, your IBC, and one for residential, one for your IRC. There's also an FAQs page posted as well. I guess in terms of this presentation, it's important for me to say that there's no way I can be comprehensive in 20 minutes. So I'll do my best to answer any questions, but please take a look at the text. If you have any questions at all for follow-up, call my office and myself or one of my staff will be happy to get you in touch with the right people to get those questions answered. Biggest question about this is the effectability zone, right? And it starts at 6,400 feet in elevation. Best kind of idea for that as you're working here in the city is if it's west of C470, it's worth giving us a call over, right? That's a good dividing line for a lot of the county there. We do have a map posted on our GIS software that's specific to this, so you can see the wildfire zones. But basically that contour line, that's a good indication that you're going to hit that 6,400 mark, and that's going to trigger these requirements to meet this Appendix Z standard. This includes all buildings, all construction. So that includes moved buildings, which is probably going to be one of the trickiest things here. Bringing something into that section of the county or a modular home, those might be a little bit more scrutinized as we move forward here, but this is brand new to us too. So if you have some specific questions about that, I'd be really interested to hear kind of what you've ran into. So what does it all mean? Well, it means everything. Residential and commercial, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about move-in sets. And probably the most common question that we get from home builders and from homeowners is, can I still build a deck with wood? And the answer to that we worked really hard to make sure is a yes. We worked in writing this with a few different places. Our fire district was the folks that started this off. All of our mountain fire districts are seeing increases in terms of increases in terms of population density up in the foothills. They're seeing more and more foam plastics and composite materials that concern them. And obviously, because of climate change, they're seeing a much longer fire season. So that's what's really sparking their initiative to come to the building departments and say, what do we have to do in order to make this better? From there, we also had some discussions with Boulder County, who has been historically doing WUI-based codes for some time, see kind of what's available in the market, how their builders reacted to it. Because for us, we didn't want to put our local builders in a position where they required materials that weren't readily available or did the kind of things that would increase costs so dramatically that they would not really have a chance to make a buck. Because at the end of the day, if they can't make a buck building a house, then they don't build a house. And that's way more important. So if you crack into this code, what you're going to end up seeing is a couple of different sections based on fire resistance rated construction, which we're all really, really familiar with out of our building codes, but then also non-combustibility. And the important thing to think about here, just from kind of a top-down perspective, is that the building code does a great job in isolating fires in compartments, right? We know how to separate hot gases from other fire compartments or fire separation areas. This is thinking about it from the outside in, and so that works a little bit differently. So in terms of isolating what materials are you allowed to use for things like exterior cladding, we talk about fire resistance rated construction in terms of assembly, right? So that's the entire wall section. That's the sheathing, whatever you might use as a substrate if you need to upgrade depending on what sort of siding or what sort of soffitting you're using, right? And there's a litany of different materials that you can use, but the important thing when submitting your documents or having this conversation is that we're going to talk to you in terms of system, right? How does this make that 1 hour fire rating? And from the fire side being on the exterior, how do we think about that? Integrity throughout the assembly is obviously the biggest concern, making sure windows, doors, all of that meets that same criteria. But ultimately, this is something that most builders are really familiar with, and they're excellent at being able to move these kind of questions forward with their design professionals and team up together in order to move forward. Non-combustibility, obviously everyone's familiar with, but what does that mean from the outside? Well, it means that materials like metal, while they won't burn, they transduce heat very well. And when we think about fires, when we think about wildfires, we have to consider what that's going to do to those internal materials. Oftentimes it's required adding things like substrates. So on a metal roof, you would add Densec or attached to a non-combustible framing member in order to meet these sorts of criteria. Ultimately, though, as you think about moving forward with other attachments, you want to keep that in mind. How do these things differ from each other? So in ignition resistant building materials, we require that whatever materials we're talking about typically meets the ASTM E84 test. That's the extended burn time test right there. You'll see on there that there's also a mention about weatherability. This has brought up some concerns from builders about things like, what about spray on intumescence? Or what about spray on fire resistant materials? You know, how do we stand with those? Typically, the biggest concern with that is maintenance and weathering, right? A lot of those materials to use on the exterior gets a little cloudy about how we're gonna make sure that those are protected consistently. So in taking a look at what materials you're going to use, obviously feel free to give us a call. We'll get you in touch with the plans examiner that will go through your material list line by line. But in terms of shopping, you're looking for that ASTM E84 test, which is going to be abundantly labeled on there. So anything at the job site, that's what your inspector is going to be looking for, and any discussions kind of on what materials you're allowed to use, that's a typical thing that's going to come up. So if you're unfamiliar with those two tests, be worth a look as to just kind of how they apply and what things you'd be looking for with them. So kind of moving through the building, we'll start at the roof. And the reason for that is because we've been doing Class A roof ratings up there for years. This is nothing new. You know, typically that's the thing that the homeowner's either going to take on themselves or it's going to be a really simple, streamlined permit. Class A roof assemblies have been required in Jeffco for a long time. Typically the stuff that we have to worry about is obviously your flat roof materials and your metal roofing systems, but that's really nothing new. Now, in terms of addressing the continuity of that, asphalt roof shingles, we've allowed for cut close valleys, California valleys, a woven valley, or a W metal valley with 90-pound felt underneath. Any of those are valid options for your roofing assembly, and we see them as just as continuous in terms of coverage for the full Class A. Now, as you move through your exterior walls, this is typically where we start to get tricky. When we talk about the exterior wall, we're talking about that 1 hour fire resistant rated construction. We've seen assemblies now where we've maybe had wood shiplap with 5/8 type X behind it. You know, things like that that have been considered opening protectives that we would typically do on a 1 hour wall, and we're just using that to help meet this criteria. What that means in terms of your fire district, though, when we invited them to a few of our contractor meetings to discuss this with the builders, is that you know, they don't know that there is gypsum board behind that wood siding. And sometimes that's going to mean that they have concerns about trying to set a fire line there because they don't know whether or not that house is defensible. So while this is a discussion that you obviously have to have with us because we have this code, I strongly encourage every builder to get in touch with your fire districts about their expectations, about their concerns. You know, that hands-on approach will really help guide your project in the right direction, make sure that your homeowner is getting the product that they really want, right? Your approved non-combustible materials, we run into a lot of hardy board siding, right? Cementitious siding, cementitious fascia, all those are going to meet this kind of criteria. Heavy timber and log wall siding, that's all going to meet it as well. Fire retardant treated wood, obviously we want to see the ratings for that. And then our ignition resistant materials, and we're back to that definition from earlier. Remember, those are going to transduce different heat. Depending on the framing member that they're attaching to, we need to be cognizant of the whole assembly that we're using. We want to make sure that's extending, you know, from your sole plate all the way up to the underside of the roof sheathing, which is going to bring us to our other typical questions that we get from a lot of builders, which has to do with how are we going to vent this roof? You know, where am I going to put my foundation vents where they're required? How are we going to handle those sorts of openings? And we're going to get there. So at the eaves, basically we're at the same sort of level of protection as the exterior wall. Now, you can take a look at a few different manuals that are out there. The Colorado State Forest Service has a great Firewise manual that you can take a look at, where they show, in terms of wildfire spread, how hot air rises, gets trapped under the eaves, and starts to become a concern as a wildfire progresses, right? What we're looking for there, basically the same level of material as your exterior cladding, right? From that, it's important to note that a lot of materials out there have been evaluated by the California Fire Marshal Service. They have a building material listing service site that is an invaluable resource for this sort of thing. So if you see some product here that doesn't fit any of these descriptions, that doesn't mean that it's disallowed. It still could be usable. We just need to scrutinize it a little further, take a look at that listing service, see if we have some evidence in order to say, absolutely, we can take this on. We can take this on. So moving on to gutters and downspouts, they do have to be protected now. It was one thing that we had never required previously. Typically, on most inspections that we do, we don't see gutters installed. And we understand that's just the nature of the business and scheduling people out. And it's only gotten worse since COVID. You know, getting subs lined up in order has definitely extended its timelines. There's no getting around it. That being said, though, where we do come out and we do see gutters provided, we do want to see a gutter guard. Now, other jurisdictions we've seen have requirements for non-combustibility. They want to see a metal guard on there, right? At this point, we have not written that in expressly into this code. We want to see a gutter guard installed because that's a step in the right direction for now. But we're making these changes incrementally. We do realize in trying to write this code, whatever we put in this is not going to solve the problem of existing building stock with failing wood siding and wood shake overnight. Those are all going to be there. And so to scrutinize the next house that's getting built, so much so that it raises the cost of construction, you know, just enormously when the neighbor next door is not taking care of that property and is propagating that wildfire spread. That's still kind of hit and miss there. So just to keep you informed, as of right now, a gutter guard is what's required of you, and certainly have that discussion with the homeowner if they want an upgrade or something like that. But that's where we stand at the moment. Now, deck's probably the biggest question, especially for the folks that live out in the hills, because building a deck is just as tantamount as building the house. It's exactly why you want it, the view. Your deck surface needs to be of a non-combustible material and approved wood thermoplastic composite lumber with an ESTM E84 flame spread no less than 200. That really does include just about any type of composite decking that we've ran into that you can typically find. During our initial evaluations on how we were going to move forward with this, we brought in some contacts from our HBA. We also spoke to some distributors in town about what they have and whether or not their stock would meet this. Specifically, Moore's Lumber had a few representatives at our contractors meetings regularly. From what I garnered from them, this really seemed like a non-issue in terms of supply. But as always, definitely scrutinize any materials that you're getting just so you meet this criteria. And if you have any questions about something that you're not sure on, feel free to reach out. Other ignition resistant materials, IPE as decking, some other exotic hardwoods definitely meet that criteria for low enough flame spread that they can just be used without issue. So you do have a lot of options out there. Additionally, you can also see our paradigm here for deck framing. The 1 hour fire resistance rated construction, which can include gypsum wrap or gypsum softening with a dry below system. There's a few different ways to go about making sure that you're meeting this criteria. Heavy timber, obviously the charring factor there makes sure that that thing's going to stand even during a wildfire event, at least for some time. And that's really one of our biggest concerns there. You'll also find that we have wood with a nominal thickness of 2 inches for joists and 4 inch for beams and columns. That really includes just about any conventional method in which you're going to frame a deck. We've had a lot of questions about that, about, well, then do I have to protect the underside of it, things like that. And we can definitely get to that. What we'd point to is a lot of industry information circulating currently. Same sites, that Firewise manual posted on the Colorado Forester Service website, things like that. They show some methods by which mitigating the combustibles down on the ground underneath the deck and making sure that there's a clear space that's defensible around the house helps keep that deck safe, even if it's conventionally framed. So at least for now, there's a few different options that you have that can get you just back to basically building the deck that you always have, but being cognizant that there might be some maintenance or some other non-combustibles that you might have to consider, xeriscaping, things like that, in order to make sure that this is meeting that criteria. Exterior windows, exterior glazing. At this point, conversations about this topic typically include things like metal frame windows, right? Things like that. After discussions with our fire districts and their presence there, they didn't have as much of a concern there as the number of either panes in the window or getting tempered glass in there. So we allow for multi-pane, we allow for tempered, we allow for decorative glass block. So there's very little restriction on this in terms of windows. The only times that we have kind of seen issues with this has been more oriented towards homeowners wanting to maybe use refuse materials for smaller projects, right? Single pane windows going into a garage that's unheated that otherwise might be a viable option, but in this case, we're not going to allow. Things like that. Exterior doors. You still have basically the gamut, solid core wood doors, metal clad, 20-minute rated doors, and obviously all glazing indoors has met the criteria for typically tempered glass for just about ever now. It's typically not much of a concern to make sure that you're getting a door with that. We really haven't ran into a circumstance where we've had to correct this out in the field. Just by identifying this early, this is the kind of thing that, once again, it's typically materials getting reused from other projects and smaller things that we've ran into circumstances where this is a concern. So ventilation, the next big question here, right, on how you're going to go about making sure that you're meeting this really important standard for being able to vent that roof while maybe eliminating some soffit venting. Vents located in the fascia, according to data from people with more expertise than I on how wildfires work, shows that by being pushed away from the house and not underneath the soffit, there's less of a chance of intake from an ember. We've also had questions about things like, well, what about your ridge vent? Typically, those are made out of plastics, very permeable. The way that we've experienced, our conversations with our fire districts, exhaust vents are less of a concern for them overall, right? That ridge vent isn't likely to intake an ember. Certainly, it could be an entrance point, but it's that intake vent lower in the soffit that's going to convect and pull that air in. That's really where you're going to possibly get some intrusion. So that's their biggest concern. And moving forward with this, we wrote in that you'd have 1/8" screening, meaning that you can create your vent a few different ways. There's a lot of materials already out there that will meet about an 1/8" opening, or you can add screening to them, just realizing that you're going to take a small reduction in the air value, the airflow coming from that particular vent. You can also make your own. We've seen that done in a few different ways by punching some holes through your blocking on an open tail rafter system, and then going ahead and making sure that screening is placed on the backside of that blocking to make sure that there's nothing too big in terms of ember size that's going to get in there. We mentioned gable and dormer vents, though we know it's atypical in terms of construction these days to see that type. Foundation vents should be located as close to grade as possible, just to mitigate the chance of airflow trying to suck those into an open crawl space or basement as well. So roof replacement, another important point here, typically for smaller projects, anything that didn't have a Class A rating before, especially, we're going to force the issue of replacing the full roof if you do a 25% improvement, so 25% repair. Previous to this, well, what we allowed was anything more than 2 squares would require a building permit, but we would allow any type of roof replacement. So if you only wanted to do 2 slopes on a roof, you could. In this area, we're going to try and catch up some of that existing building stock, especially with these old existing cedar shakes, things like that. Those are the kind of kindling that really spread wildfire quickly, so we're going to try and tackle that issue first. So if you go back and you want to, say, do a half roof replacement, there's a good chance we might be talking about a full. We do have a list of materials that don't fit this criteria as exceptions. So things like concrete and clay tile, simply because of the vast expense that could come from requiring a full replacement due to a repair. We are going to allow you to go ahead and do partial replacements on those. So we'd issue a permit for, say, a 50% replacement, things like that. Now, right here is Holy Grail when it comes to what we're talking about. It's that CAL FIRE building material service list. I can't stress enough how important it is to spend a little time getting familiarized with how to search the site properly and get what you want out of it. What will happen is when you select a particular topic, say decking or exterior or under eaves, you'll find a list of materials there that at first glance you'll see mostly the product name, the manufacturer, but that's about it. You won't see specifics on it. If you download the PDF that comes off of that page, though, you will see the installation specifics for how they're going about meeting this rating, so that way you can make sure that you're meeting that criteria. Some of these things will tell you wood shiplap siding when you first take a look at it. Then as you scrutinize a little further, you'll find that it's only for 5/4, and that material might not be readily available for you. That's the kind of thing that you might want to bring up with your distributor. You also might want to just check to make sure that any materials that you aren't specifically bidding but you know are going to end up on the job are definitely going to still meet this criteria too. Overall, we see a lot of success once people start using this regularly to their advantage, but it just takes a little time to get used to. It's not too bad of a website, but I can't encourage you enough. Spend some time getting to know it. And if you see something that either isn't there and you think should be, feel free to give us a call. We're happy to get in touch with some manufacturers. I had a call from LP just this week about some of their products and making sure that we're kind of advertising this on their behalf to say that, hey, there are options to go and figure out whether or not this meets your criteria without calling, your sales rep immediately. You got a few different options to look this up for yourself and see if this works. So this is an example of one of those reports that you would consider pulling down. If you don't have a report for your material that you'd like to use, then we can still scrutinize it further with you. We'll take a look at the flame spread, the smoke spread, whatever information we can get from some good reputable sources, typically like an ICCES report, things like that. So I can't stress enough that we are cognizant that while this isn't a major change, a lot of you guys have already been building well above the standard. In scrutinizing some of these products, it's important for us to recognize that there are options and there's room for creativity on how we're going to meet this criteria. So if there is anything that you have a question about, feel free to give us a call. We'll get in touch with the manufacturer with you. We'll do a conference call. We'll figure out what we can and can't do with it. So plan review expectation, right? This is kind of one of those big hurdles. If we can save you on the design side and on the bid by making it clear that these things are what's required, then obviously you're advantaged compared to your competition out there. Please make sure that if you can, just like you would on any other general notes page, take a few minutes to have your design professional come up with a list of exactly these same criteria so we can quickly reference these for you. If we see something that's a red flag immediately, we can tell you. It'll save you redesigning later. We do have, and I'll flip quickly to this next page, we do have a sort of cheat sheet available here in the office. So if you send a small project down, we can kind of walk you through that same thing, or you can use it as a template. Feel free. Essentially though, what we're looking for is tell us what material you're going to use. Do you have a CAL FIRE listing for it? If you do, fantastic. If not, give us your flame spread, smoke spread. Tell us what you can tell us about the materials and its characteristics, and we can start taking a look immediately to see if it meets one of our criteria spelled out in the actual heart of the document. Other than that, what we're looking for is basically a statement that you're going to adhere to this. So if there are field changes, things like that, you're going to make us aware of it. You're going to provide those manufacturer specs on site as requested, those sorts of things. And that's what I have for you at the moment. So I don't know if at this point we'd move to Q&A.
No, that was great information, Andre. Thank you so much. And we'll go, actually from here, we'll move over to Steve and have him chat for a little bit. And then we'll do a 10 minutes of Q&A at the very end.
Sounds great.
All right, so is everybody able to see my screen all right? Shake your head. Yep, I see some head shaking.
Looks good. Looks
All
good.
right, good. What I've been asked, first of all, it's great to be on another meeting with the HBA. We do a lot of work with the HBA and some training sessions for them, for you all, and enjoy coming back and talking a little bit about codes. For those of you not familiar, well, first of all, we're going to talk about the 2018 residential code and some of the major changes that we've seen between that and the 15 code. There are a number of jurisdictions that have adopted the code. Denver is probably obviously the most current one. They've adopted it. Greenwood Village is going through the process right now. So there's a lot of jurisdictions. Cherry Hills, we've adopted it. And so there's a lot of jurisdictions that have started to adopt the 2018 code. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so is the big changes. Obviously, can't cover everything in 20 minutes. We won't be talking about any editorial stuff or those kind of things, and give you kind of hopefully a brief overview of some of the big changes as we see it. To be very honest with you, this is probably the first addition that we've seen that I would say that there's no huge earth-shattering changes like we've seen in the past. So I think they're all pretty, I mean, there's some decent changes, some bigger than others, but as far as, changing the whole way we look at building a home, I don't see a lot of difference there. So right off the bat, one of my favorite subjects is alternate designs, materials. Andre kind of touched on that a little bit with his presentation. And one of the things that I think was a great change is that if you submit an alternate design or what some people call an admin mod for a project, and the building department decides to turn you down and disapprove your alternate, they must give you a reason in writing as to why they're not approving it. So I think I really think that's a good change to kind of make sure that we have a good reason for not getting something approved other than just saying, well, I don't like it, so you can't use it. Anytime you do an alternate, it's important that you make sure that it meets the intent of the code and those kind of things. So you just got to make sure you provide as much information as you can to the building department for that. Many of you are familiar with Manual J, and more jurisdictions are starting to require Manual Js on homes. It's been in the residential code since the beginning, actually, since 2000. But a lot of jurisdictions chose not to enforce it. Now that a lot are starting to do that. So one of the changes that we've made in the 2018 is that the design criteria for the Manual J is now going to be included as part of the design criteria in the front of the code. So each building department, when they adopt the 2019 code, will need to fill out this table for their area. And I think this is the numbers for the Denver area. So it kind of gives you an idea of how we do that, so that now we're all using the same values in doing those Manual Js. So hopefully this will get people more comfortable with using Manual Js and do a better job, or more efficient job, let me put it that way, of providing good HVAC systems for homes. For those of you that do townhouses, to be very honest with you, the 2015 IRC was terrible. There was a major, somewhat of a major change made between the 12 and the 15 that the code used to say that townhouses had to be built as separate, as considered separate structures, and then you ended up doing either 2 one-hour walls or the common 2-hour wall that we see typically in a townhouse. They took that language out because some jurisdictions were saying, well, that's an exterior wall, so now it has to be a brace wall line and have to provide bracing in that wall, where maybe you could do 2 townhouses and do a perpendicular brace wall line there. So they took that out to get rid of that whole concept. But when they did that, they just went to the common wall, which from a pure technical standpoint, the 15 would have said you can just do a 2-hour wall. You couldn't do 2 one-hour walls. And so in the 2018, what we've done is we've changed that language to say, okay, the separation of townhouses have to be done in accordance with one of 2 sections. So 302.2.1 or 2.2. So from the standpoint of what you've been doing probably is not going to change at all. But now you do have a specific option of providing the 2 one-hour wall assemblies, and so you can do it that way. But most commonly here in Colorado, most of us are just doing common walls with a 2-hour shaft wall in the center, and then your 2 framed walls on each side. So it's if the building's not provided with fire sprinklers, it's a 2-hour separation. If you have sprinklers, that can go down to a 1-hour separation. Some of the continuity requirements changed a little bit. But like I said, I don't think you're going to build your townhouses any differently than you have in the past. Most everybody in this area is doing the 2-hour wall, so common wall in between. So there's your common wall between the 2. This one's not going to be a very popular one, I don't think. It wasn't popular when it first came in, where we required protection of the underfloor assembly to protect firefighters from falling through. If you're not familiar with that change that came in that 12, I believe it was, I-joists and floor trusses burn out in about 7 or 8 minutes. They've done actual tests at UL to show that. And that's where this came from, because about 7 or 8 minutes into the fire is when the firefighters show up to the home. And we've had several of them get hurt falling into basements and those kind of things. So the language to protect that underside of the floor with chipboard was added in 12 or 15. I think it was 12 for sure. And so they've added some language to exception 2 that says, okay, it used to say that if you had a floor assembly over a crawl space intended for storage, or if you had fuel-fired equipment down there, you had to protect the floor, or you didn't have to protect the floor. Now it's added electric-powered heating appliance. So if you have an electric water heater or electric furnace down in the crawl space, you're back to providing that protection on the bottom side of the floor, or some of the other alternates that are out there to protect the I-joists and those trusses. So this is not, I don't think this is going to be a real popular change with folks since they added the electric appliances down there. We've had some problems with glass balusters and glass guardrails. So we've added some language that says that you have to have a top rail or handrail. Must be supported by not less than 3 glass baluster panels or otherwise supported to remain in place, so that if one panel drops out, they all don't drop out. So this particular picture would be in compliance. Each one is held in place by itself. It's got a rail over the top. The exception says that you don't need that top rail if you use laminated glass with 2 or more glass plies of equal thickness. So apparently we're having some problems with people falling through some of these glass balusters that we've seen going into homes. So inspectors are going to start looking for that railing at the top, just not the glass being the top of the guardrail. This is one of my favorite section changes. If you remember right, in probably the 2012, the maximum rise of a stair in a home was 144 inches. In the 2015, we changed it to 147 inches, or 12'3". The reason that we did that was because people said, well, you can't get an even number of risers at 7 3/4 into 144 inches. So if we do even number of risers at 7 3/4, we get 147 inches. So we went, okay, you can go to 147 inches. Well, nobody was happy with that. So what they did is they said, well, newer homes, especially our higher end homes, are now going in with 10-foot ceiling heights. So if you take the 10-foot ceiling height and the depth of the truss and the floor sheathing, all those kind of things, they said, we need to increase the height to 151 inches. So it's like, okay, are we going to keep changing this every code cycle? I don't know. It's a little, I don't know, for me, it's a little frustrating. Primarily because, to be honest with you, I'm the one that put the 12-foot maximum in the code in the first place, because at one point, the IRC had no limitation on the maximum dimension between landings. So we'll see what happens with this one. It's kind of like, come on guys, we got to decide what we're going to do. This doesn't look good. You know, we'll figure it out and get it done. So now you can go 151 inches between floors if you want to have your stairs go between the two. So we'll see. Y'all think this passes the 4-inch clearance there? I don't think so, but it's pretty. It is pretty. So that's a code geek in me, sorry. All right, these 2 exceptions I think are gonna be well received, at least by homeowners. They both basically say the same thing. The first one talks about alternating tread devices. If you're not familiar with an alternating tread device, this is kind of one of those where you'll notice that the tread is on the right-hand side of the stair, and then it switches over to the left and then right and then left and right. So you basically just, the way you walk up the stairs is how you go up. And so we added alternating tread devices as well as ship ladders to the 2015 code. However, you could not use them as a means of egress off of an upper level. So we have new exceptions for both the ship ladder and the alternating tread device, that if you have a loft or a mezzanine or area up there that's less than or 200 square feet or less, and it doesn't provide access to a kitchen or a bathroom, direct access, then you can have that ship's ladder or alternating tread device serve as the egress off of that loft. I, in some ways, like this. Some people would argue that, hey, that's not the safest way to get down, but my experiences of I've had people building homes that they want this little sleeping loft up there above something, and we come and do a final inspection. They got a beautiful ship's ladder going up there, and we have to tell them, nope, you got to take that down because it's not a approved stair. And we know that as soon as we leave, they take it out. As soon as we leave, we know that the stair goes back in. So I think this was something that, to address what people are wanting to do in their homes and those kind of things. There are specifications as to how to build the alternating tread devices in the ship's ladder. So riser height, width, handrails, the whole bit. So we'll see what happens. This is also actually tied to the change that went in the 15 for tiny homes. And because tiny homes, many of us that opposed the tiny home edition of the code was not because we're against tiny homes, but our argument was if it's good enough for a tiny home, why it shouldn't be good for a regular home? And so this is kind of a fit for that because the tiny home provisions allow ship's ladder and alternating tread devices as part of the means of egress. So I think it was a pretty decent change. This is a requirement for interconnection of smoke alarms. We'll talk about both smoke alarms and CO alarms. Smoke alarms, you used to say that if you had to remove ceiling or wall finishes here, that you didn't have to interconnect the smoke alarms. That language has been deleted. So now all smoke alarms, including, I know that we've got a lot of remodelers on the line. If you're doing a remodel to a home, you now have to connect all the smoke alarms together. Now, you can go ahead and rewire things if you want, but this is intended to address the new wireless smoke alarm systems that you see. I know I have a wireless system in our house. It's one of the Nest systems. I really like it because if the fire alarm goes off, I get a notice on my telephone, on my cell phone. So I could be out of town or something and see the notice and call my wife and go, are you okay? Or see what's going on. So I think this, this is going to be a different requirement for a lot of people because now you can't just go in and put a normal battery operated smoke alarm in if you're doing a remodel. You can do the battery operated, but now they got to be wireless that communicate with the other alarms. So we'll see what happens with that. On the other hand, for CO alarms, we don't have that exception, or we still have the exception that says, okay, if you have to remove interior walls and ceiling finishes, then you don't have to interconnect the CO alarms. So if people go, well, how did that happen? Well, you have two different code changes and people didn't pay attention to the two. And so, in the 15, there wasn't any language about interconnecting the CO alarms. So somebody said, well, we need to make sure that those are tied together and one goes off, they all go off. And so it was like, oh man. And then when this came out, we went, okay, so I fully expect a code change for the 2021 code, and I have to go back and see what happened. But I would expect the change to basically delete that exception as well, because they have wireless CO alarms as well. I'm a big proponent of the combo alarms. So if you're doing remodeling, I think that's the way to go. By the way, just so you know, the 2021 codes are basically written. We've got a few more things to take care of, and they'll be published and available at the end of toward the end of the year. And we'll be starting to work on the 2024 codes. So those code changes will all start going through the process next year. It's hard to believe, but we don't even have a code out, and we're already getting ready to change it. So it should be a fun code change cycle. So 324 was a new section that came in the 15 for solar energy systems. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there for both photovoltaic as well as BP, or building integrated systems. We've got a little bit about water type systems, hydronic type systems. The majority is PV, but you've got that. So the big change here is pathways for fire department access to the roof. So it now requires, basically, and I'll go to the diagram here, probably is easier to do, is a 36-inch wide path up the side and along the top and along each valley. And the whole purpose of this is so the firefighters can get on the roof and do their operations for preventing the fire and those kind of things. There is an exception if a jurisdiction does not do rooftop operations, then we don't need the paths. But generally, you're going to need to make sure that those paths get provided, and so they can cut vent holes in the roof. So this has been in the fire code for a couple of code cycles, and we finally got it into the residential code. The other part of this is that we can't have any panels, solar panels, need an emergency escape and rescue opening. Obvious reasons. These get to be very slick. We don't want people climbing on a PV panel and a break and have any problems there. So anytime you've got an egress window up there, you've got to provide a 36-inch wide path from the egress window down to the bottom of the roof. Unvented crawl spaces, a new option for you. You can provide a dehumidifier in the crawl space as long as it decides to provide 70 pints of moisture removal per day for every 1,000 square feet of crawl space. So another option. I don't think we've seen a lot of evidence yet to say how well that would work in our climate, but it might be an option to mechanical ventilation in those crawl spaces. All right, this is not going to be a very popular one, but I think it's necessary. Essentially what we've done is removed essentially an exception that says you don't have a water resistant barrier on a detached accessory structure. So basically what we're saying now is all structures must have a water resistant barrier installed in accordance with the manufacturer's installation instructions. So, your building wraps, those kind of things are now going to have to be on your detached garages, barns, pool houses, any of those kind of things. So obviously to help protect the structure from moisture. So we've got that. Energy code real quick. The 75% of permanently installed high efficacy lamps has been changed to 90%. The 2021 code will go to 100%. So that's kind of been the pathway. We've got a new thing called the Energy Rating Index. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a different way of doing performance energy for the building. And so you'll see some different things going on as far as your energy raters, and be able to do that. Gives you these, depending on climate zone, we're in climate zone 5, so you're going to have an energy rating index of 61. So those of you using your energy raters and going that route, you'll have another option to follow. Plumbing wise, I kind of like this one because it's always a problem with these big tubs, self-standing tubs, that had the plumbing code said you had to have an overflow outlet. Well, now you don't have to. And if it's not installed, where an overflow is not installed, if it is installed, then it has to be 1.5 inches. But if you have one of these self-standing tubs, you don't have to have an overflow anymore. So that'll make it a lot easier on the higher end homes. This one's going to be interesting to see how it works. We can't use saddle tap fittings anymore. So your water line to the refrigerator, for example, will have to have a proper fitting. They won't be able to use that saddle tap to put that in. I wish I could tell you why they made that provision. I'm assuming that they leak so much and they don't really do what they're supposed to do. So we'll see how that works. So with that, there's my contact information real quick. Once again, I want to thank HBA for having me come along and present the code changes. So I guess we'll do questions now.
Yeah, thank you to Steve and Andre for being our speakers today. That was really great information. Andre, I love that Jeffco really works with builders and homeowners to fit what materials works best with them. And Steve, I really enjoyed that. Yeah, same type of thing that the builders really, you guys really work, the codes really work with builders. So that's awesome. Does anyone have questions for Steve and Andre? We'd love to answer this for you.
Andre covered it all.
Yeah, it was actually really thorough. So we appreciate that.
I'm glad I could be helpful.
I have one question for Andre. Are you seeing more and more of the roof vents that are on the top of the roof above where your exterior wall is versus going through the soffit?
Correct. Yeah, we are seeing a lot of design professionals just want to get away from soffit venting in order to just not have to worry about this at all or worry about an install problem. So definitely a lot more top vented. But of course, with where we're talking about getting up in the hills, people like their high ceilings. So we see a lot of cold roofs too. So we see a lot of mixed systems that don't always rely on the same amount of venting that that a conventional framed house would.
Excellent. Thank you.
This is a question for both of you guys. What type of challenges or what is the main question that you get from builders in regards to both of these topics?
Steve, please.
The biggest question is why? Why did you change that? And most of the time we can answer it. Sometimes it's a little difficult. But you know, I think it's just a lot of people. I don't like to say that it's a new code anymore. I like to say that it's an updated code because we're learning things new every day. New technologies coming along. I mean, think about it. PV has been, photovoltaic's been around for years, decades, and we're just now getting stuff into the code. So that's usually the question is why does that change occur? And, you're always asking, people are always asking for intent and those kind of things.
To answer your question, I would say most builders, as far as these wildland codes go, they get it. They get it 100%. They understand that people are getting packed into smaller and smaller areas. We watch the population density in areas like Conifer and Evergreen really skyrocket just over the last few years as we've had more and more people move to the state. So they understand, and a lot of them even live up in the hills themselves. But they also see it as a combination of things, and it really is. Without making site improvements in order to mitigate, your foliage, limb up your trees, things like that, if you live in a concrete bunker, if the fire department can't see your house because there's so many trees in the way that aren't limbed up, it kind of doesn't matter. So they're recognizing that this is a kind of a community effort issue. It's also got a lot to do with the response time for a lot of these fire departments. As time's gone on, they're mostly volunteer, so they're doing the best they can with what they have, but they recognize that they're a limited resource too, and so are we. So I think the end result is that everyone's on board for the concept because we're an inclusive community that tries, everyone's trying to help each other do the best they can. The hard part is the details, the nuances, and I think that's why we try to emphasize flexibility.
Steve, I got a question. Is there anything, not in the next code cycle, but even in the future that builders should really be on the lookout for or be preparing for?
Yeah, there's actually something coming up most likely in the 2021 code, is a huge, how do I put this, jump in the energy code again. There were several code changes that, real quick, there's the process in the ICC is you have a first hearing with the committee who looks at something and either approves it, disapproves, or approves of modifying. There were 20 changes that the committee disapproved. Then there's the second step, which is called the public hearing step, where anybody can challenge what the committee did. And there was some challenges to those 20 items. And the membership at that hearing, the people that were there and listening to the testimony and those kind of things, also disapproved the code change. Then the third process is what we call the online voting, where now anybody that's a code official that's involved in the enforcement of the code can then vote online for a code change. And to overturn that disapproval, you need a 2/3 majority. And that's very difficult to do. However, on these 20 items, 19 of them got overturned to approved as submitted. So the committee, as well as the people in attendance at the public hearing, felt this isn't appropriate and turned it down. And what happened was an energy organization sent out a voting guide to a bunch of their members, and they were registered voters and were able to overturn it. So those changes are going through an appeal process, which NAHB is one of those appellants. I have to be honest with you, I don't think they have a chance of winning because everything was done per the policy. But, you know, and I'm not a big energy person, but I've been told that they are going to be huge hits on construction and energy. So that's going to be the 2021 code, which is going to make it really interesting to see what jurisdictions do with the adoption of that code.
If anyone has additional questions, please enter them into the chat. I have a question for Andre along those same lines, along what you were talking about, Steve. Have you guys thought about what construction details like continuous insulation on exterior walls might mean in terms of changes to that wildfire amendment or appendix?
Sure. So typically on systems like that, we're seeing that non-combustibility clause used rather than trying to find some way to make that assembly compliant, right? So they're typically going with materials that when exposed to wildfire over a long enough time, yes, they will transduce heat. And once again, like anything else in the code, any passive system, it's a matter of time. It's not a preventative that'll just keep it from happening. It's a matter of time. As we see more mixed systems right now, that's kind of nascent here for the most part. We don't see a ton of them. But as we see more mixed systems, I imagine that we're going to scrutinize that further and kind of see what direction that wants to go. But obviously, this is a complicated one. There's a lot of things that you can do as a designer in terms of texture on the building, in terms of grade and slope that can help mitigate hot air pressing against the house quickly and spreading that wildfire quickly. So it's one of those things that's so dependent on site improvement that you have a lot of different options to try and reasonably say a house is doing everything it can. So
thank you. I am actually not seeing any additional questions coming up. So I want to thank you guys again, both Steve and Andre, for blessing us with your time and your wisdom today.
No problem.
And I also think that we want to, we want to thank everyone for joining us with the CBRC, and also thank our sponsors again with Lifescape, Belgard, Colton, Pella, Kitchler, Ferguson, and also BAC. And Jason, do you have any additional closing words you'd like to add?
On behalf of the CBRC, we just really appreciate your all time, and these are ever-changing codes, and we're constantly learning this stuff. So we always appreciate your time and effort in keeping us up to date.
No
And
problem.
thank you again, Steve and Andre.
Thank you. Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you very much for having us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Guys.
All right.
See y'all.
Have a good day, guys.
You.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.